Here are two fascinating premises to consider. One, with its history there's a haunting, and two, ghosts are everywhere whether we know it or not. Want one more? Many times ghosts want something from us, and oftentimes we feel compelled to meet their demands and assume responsibility for administering justice to some wrongdoing committed against them. Because ghosts can affect the past, present, and future, because their past affects our present state and how we regard their presence in our lives going forward. Because an unsettled or unsatisfying past always results in a reimagination of what could have been or what could be otherwise. And that is the very essence of the spirit human dynamic. This next story is about a string of hauntings that spanned over 60 years, and the only common denominators are the location where they all took place and the message that was being sent. West Bay Lake is located in Vilas County, Wisconsin. The surrounding lands were at one time mostly forest before the county's establishment in the 1800s. Before the settlers came, the Chippewa people hunted, fished, and lived there for centuries. On the shore of West Bay Lake stand the remains of Summerwind Mansion, long purported to be the most haunted house in the entire state of Wisconsin. The stories of those who lived there during its checkered past have become legendary, as have the chilling legends that have surrounded it ever since. Because long before the mansion burned to the ground, the house played host to a multitude of ghostly and demonic activities. The home has also seen its share of mysterious and gruesome discoveries, and while the once majestic dwelling is but a shell of its former self, its place in the chronicles of the supernatural remain firmly in place. Summerwind's origins date back to 1916, when United States Secretary of Commerce Robert Lamont built the house as a vacation retreat for he and his family. The property was situated on 80 acres of land and included 3 fireplace chimneys, guest rooms, and a detached building that served as servants' quarters. It sat in a remote location, accessible only by a dirt road, and the brutal Wisconsin winters made it difficult to travel to. It became known as the Lamont Mansion, and in the 15 years the Lamonts owned the property, an array of bizarre occurrences revealed themselves. Things began to take shape over the first winter spent there, as servants reported seeing an apparition of a woman standing outside one of the windows of their quarters, who would glare menacingly at them from the courtyard. Eventually, her presence would be witnessed inside the building as well. Mr. Lamont initially dismissed the sightings as either paranoia, active imaginations, or perhaps the effects of a long isolated winter in the very secluded location. Despite these consistent claims of unusual activity, the Lamonts continued to live in the home in relative peace, until one particularly disturbing event took place. Alone in the home eating dinner in the kitchen one night, the couple was startled as the basement door began to shake. Mr. Lamont, suspecting an intruder was in their home, ran to get his revolver. He very cautiously made his way down the stairs to confront whomever was there, but found no one. As he started walking back up the stairs, standing at the top was the apparition of a man who appeared to materialize into a solid figure, simply glaring at him. The form was so strikingly real that Lamont fired 2 shots into it, which passed right through the figure, the bullets striking and lodging themselves in the basement door. The couple packed up their belongings and fled the house, never to return. The house would sit empty for many years until Lamont's death in 1948, after which it changed hands a number of times until it was purchased by the Kiefer family sometime around 1950. But like the Lamonts and their servants, they too began to experience some very odd goings-on. Many ran the gamut of what we have come to know as typical phenomena associated with haunted houses. Objects would move by themselves, strange noises permeated the house at all hours, and shadowy figures would emerge and move about from room to room. This was accompanied by an ominous feeling of being watched. They would eventually depart the home abruptly, leaving their belongings behind. They would rent the house to various visitors to the area, but would not enter the home themselves, instead simply handing the keys to their guests before driving off. Mrs. Kiefer offered what possessions they had left behind to others, but made it quite clear that if anything bad happened as a result of removing things from the house, she would not be held responsible. Again, the property would sit ownerless, falling into disrepair over a number of years. The local community had become growingly aware of the strange events taking place there and began to refer to it as the old haunted house. Then in 1969, Ginger Hinshaw was visiting a friend who told her about the house and convinced her to go with her to see it in person. Upon seeing the house, she immediately felt deep empathy for it, as the once splendid old home was literally falling apart, and she was quickly overcome by the feeling that it was somehow up to her to save it. She grew increasingly enamored with the idea of buying and renovating the home, and brought her husband Arnold, who owned a construction company, out to see it. It was through the lens of his occupation that he too saw immense potential in the house, as the type of place they could raise their large family of 6 children. Their offer to the Kiefers was quickly accepted. But one member of the family, 9-year-old April, didn't share her parents' enthusiasm for the home, and felt it was a nasty, decrepit place that just gave her a bad feeling. But Arnold and Ginger were certain she would come around once the house was brought back to its intended state. The Hinshaws, not to be deterred by legends and tall tales, resolved to do much of the work themselves. But soon Ginger's enthusiasm began to progress into an obsession, at one point spot testing 11 different color shades just to match the woodwork. At the opposite end was her husband Arnold, who over time started to lose interest in the home. He would wander about the house, increasingly becoming detached from everyone and everything else, starting projects that he would quickly abandon. The only thing that seemed to stir his interest was an old Hammond organ that had been left behind. He began to play it, first intermittently and then incessantly at all hours of the day and night, as he became further disconnected from his family. Arnold came to believe that some concealed force was compelling him to play the instrument, and that stopping would result in something dreadful happening. It was clear that in a short period of time, the previously happy and successful business and family man was now slipping into madness. As his playing and isolation from loved ones increased, strange activity began to occur in the house. Items would constantly vanish, only to reappear in different places during times when no one was in the house. Dining table chairs would be found out of place, pressed up against the wall. The sensation of being watched or stalked extended throughout the entire home, and the sounds of a baby crying would be heard all through the night, though it sounded much more like someone attempting to impersonate the sound of an infant's cries. As the Hinshaws walked through the house, the sounds of footsteps would pursue them, as if someone or something was following close behind. By this time, Arnold had morphed into someone his family could barely recognize, growing more angry, detached, and unstable. In one gruesome incident, the family's pet raccoon escaped from the house, and Arnold ordered their terrified children into the dark, foreboding wilderness to find it. Ginger would intervene before any harm could come to them, but when Arnold eventually located the animal, he would end its life as they looked on in horror. Ginger, meanwhile, tried to put on a brave face and bring as much normalcy to the home as possible. One night, as she was hosting a dinner party, she excused herself to go fetch some snacks from the kitchen. The otherwise jovial atmosphere was interrupted by a piercing scream from the parlor. When Ginger ran back to the room, she saw her gathered guests staring in equal parts terror and amazement as the form of an apparition appeared before their eyes. The guests hastily left the property, and the Hinshaws would have no further contact with any of them. In only 2 months' time, the family's dream home had become a living nightmare. Arnold's playing style took on a more ominous tone, and he had by then stopped working, his company folding up as a result, leaving them with no source of income to pay their mortgage or utilities, let alone continue renovations. The daughters became convinced the house was at the heart of the family's plight, and their depression and sense of hopelessness grew so pronounced that thoughts of taking their own lives began to manifest within them. For her part, a terrified Ginger took to sleeping in the woods rather than spend another night there. When the winter came, the family was at the absolute depths of despair. The utilities had been shut off for lack of payment, and water had to be carried from the nearby lake. Without heat, the family huddled in the living room around the fireplace, resorting to burning furniture in a desperate effort to stay warm. While pulling apart anything wooden in her room to feed the fire, April came upon a hidden crawl space. She ventured inside the small opening, and her curiosity quickly turned to horror as she discovered a pile of human bones along with a skull that had tangled black hair still attached to it. Now at her wit's end, Ginger walked to the closest neighbor's house and phoned her father, Ray Bober, to come and pick up her and the kids. On the ride out, Ginger went into great detail about the goings-on in the house to her skeptical father, who chose to ignore any talk of ghosts or hauntings. Arnold would stay but one more night in the house before he too left. The story goes that he was eventually committed to an asylum. His whereabouts remain unknown, never having any contact with his family again. Meanwhile, Ginger, vowing to never step foot in the house again, was nonetheless curious to know what existed in the home, and began to research the realm of the supernatural. By 1972, she and the girls were living in Ontario, Canada. The house was foreclosed on and would go up for sale at auction when it was purchased by someone known only as Mrs. Murray. But her ownership would be short-lived, as a prospective buyer approached her about her interest in selling the house, having developed a keen interest in the property. That interested party would be none other than Raymond Bober, Ginger's father. Unbeknownst at the time to he and his son, Ray Jr., who had accompanied him, Mrs. Murray also had a particularly unnerving experience there that so shook her that she had stopped going to the house. Ray Jr. had recently been discharged from the Army, where he served in Vietnam, and a project of this magnitude might be good to help him assimilate back into the world. As the men entered the house, it wasn't long before they felt that all too familiar sense of being watched. But despite any misgivings they might have had otherwise, given its past history, they agreed to purchase the home, and Ray Jr. immediately set forth to begin renovations. They encountered difficulty in finding local contractors to take on the job, as the house's eerie reputation resulted in an unwillingness to even step foot inside. In the early construction phases, Ray Jr. was cleaning up and heard some unfamiliar voices. As he walked toward the voices, he claimed to have heard gunshots and the unmistakable smell of gunpowder, something he was familiar with from his tour of duty. As he searched the house, he came upon the basement door, where he discovered 2 bullet holes, those left behind by the pistol of Robert Lamont some 40 years earlier. As he turned away from the door, an apparition of a man with a misshapen face was staring directly back at him. When the form began to advance toward him, Ray bolted from the house, got in his vehicle, and drove away as fast as he could. He would not return to the house after this extraordinary incident. Despite his daughter's experiences there, Ray Bober, with the intent to turn the mansion into a restaurant and inn, showed the plans to her while Ray Jr. sat in silence, biting his nails incessantly. Ginger, who was part of her research into the paranormal, had studied hypnosis, offered to help him with this habit. As she put her brother into a hypnotic trance, a cold chill filled the room and the lights began to flicker. Then Ray Jr. began to speak in a different voice, as if he was in the throes of possession. The voice speaking through him claimed to be that of an old man of 70 who alleged he was strong but his children were weak, and that he hated them for all their weakness. Becoming concerned about her brother, Ginger tried to awaken him from his trance-like state, but had a difficult time doing so. She then produced a crucifix she always carried and commanded whatever had invaded Ray Jr.'s body to leave him. And with that, things began to settle down, and a calmness swept over both he and the room in general. It was at this point he told his father and sister for the very first time of the experience he had with the apparition in the early stages of the restoration. Now suddenly intrigued by the prospect of someone or something trying to communicate from the afterlife, Ray Sr. asked Ginger to put him under hypnosis to try to ascertain what, if any, messages were being sent. Unlike his daughter, son, or the local construction community, Bober was actually captivated by the strangeness and chose to be proactive in trying to get to the bottom of things. After a considerable amount of time, Ginger was able to place her dad under hypnosis. During this session, he claimed to have been transported to the basement, where he found a box buried in a small nook under some rocks, and opening it, saw a 1767 land grant to the house, assigned to a colonial explorer named Jonathan Carver. Carver had at one time negotiated a treaty between warring Native American tribes, and for those efforts was granted the land where Summerwind was now located. Bober Sr. then claimed Carver's children could not produce the document which had prohibited them from inheriting the land. Suspecting that perhaps a spirit was guiding them to this certificate, Ginger and Ray Jr. put their fears aside and accompanied their father to the basement of Summerwind. Unfortunately, even though the nook was exactly where their father said it would be, a thorough search of the basement and subsequently the entire house revealed no such box or document. With that, all agreed it was best for all of them to leave Summerwind one final time and get on with their lives without the spiritual and paranormal burden of the home weighing on them. When Bober called an end to the project, he went on to write a book in 1979 titled The Carver Effect, about his personal experiences at Summerwind. The house once again would sit empty until 1986, when 3 investors purchased it with the same idea of restoring it to its former grandeur. That is, until 1988, when it was struck by lightning and burned to the ground, leaving only its foundation and chimneys as a dark reminder of its past. Right now, there's another set of interested buyers that are next in line to attempt to restore Summerwind to its original splendor, and we can only wait and wonder how that's going to turn out. The long history of supernatural events there can likely be narrowed down to 2 causes, either the land or the home itself. But what seems to be irrefutable in either case is that once again, spirits are trying to speak to us. And if we learn to listen, they have some amazing stories to tell.